There exists an artifact so controversial, so impossibly ancient, that mainstream academia has spent decades trying to dismiss it, reinterpret it, and bury it beneath layers of skeptical analysis. It is a document carved in wedge-shaped script on clay tablets nearly 4,000 years ago, yet it claims to record events stretching back over 250,000 years into the mists of prehistory. This is the Sumerian King List, and what it reveals about our forgotten past is nothing short of earth-shattering. 8 kings ruling for a combined total of 241,200 years before a catastrophic flood swept over the earth. Rulers with reigns lasting 28,800 years, 36,000 years, even 43,200 years. Numbers so staggering, so impossibly vast, that they seem to defy every law of nature, every principle of human biology, every accepted fact about our species. But here is the question that haunts every scholar who encounters this ancient text. What if these numbers are not myth? What if they are not symbolic exaggeration or religious propaganda? What if, buried in the cuneiform characters pressed into Mesopotamian clay by the hands of long-dead scribes, lies a coded message about humanity's true origins, a chronicle of a lost epoch when beings far different from us walked the earth and ruled over the first cities of civilization? Tonight, we descend into one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. We will examine the physical evidence, decode the mathematical patterns hidden in those impossible reign lengths, confront the uncomfortable parallels with other ancient traditions from across the globe, and explore the radical theories that suggest the King List is not mythology at all, but a distorted historical record of something we have been trained not to believe. Something that would fundamentally alter our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The story begins not in ancient Sumer, but in the cramped, dusty halls of a museum in early 20th century England. Picture the scene. It is somewhere around 1906. A peculiar, brilliant man named Hermann Hilprecht, a German-American scholar with a reputation for being as difficult as he was talented, sits at a wooden table in a quiet corner surrounded by wooden crates filled with fragments of broken clay. These are not ordinary fragments. They are pieces of humanity's earliest attempts at writing shipped from the ruins of Nippur in what is now modern Iraq, one of the most sacred cities of ancient Mesopotamia. Among the thousands of broken tablets and cylinder fragments, Hilprecht's trained eye catches something unusual. A small piece of baked clay, covered in the distinctive wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script. He begins to translate, his pen moving quickly across his notebook, and as the ancient Sumerian words reveal themselves, his breath catches. This is not a merchant's receipt or a temple inventory. This is a king list, a genealogical record claiming to document every ruler who had ever held power in the land of Sumer, stretching back not just centuries but impossibly deep into the distant past. This fragment was the first piece of what would become one of archaeology's most puzzling discoveries. Since Hilprecht's initial find, at least 18 additional copies or fragments of the Sumerian King List have been recovered from various sites across ancient Mesopotamia, most notably from Nippur itself, the religious heart of Sumer, but also from Susa in ancient Elam and even Tel Leilan in Upper Mesopotamia. No two versions are completely identical. Each contains variations, additions, omissions, the fingerprints of different scribes working in different cities at different times, each adapting the list to serve their own political or religious purposes. Yet despite these differences, a core narrative emerges with startling consistency, a single underlying tradition that all these scribes drew upon, a shared memory of how kingship began and who the first rulers were. The most complete and best preserved version is an 8-inch tall, 4-sided clay prism discovered in 1922 during an expedition to the ancient city of Larsa in southern Mesopotamia. It was found by British archaeologist Herbert Weld Blundell, and today it resides in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, where it is known as the Weld Blundell Prism. This remarkable artefact, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, is inscribed with 2 columns of text on each of its 4 faces. Originally, it would have had a wooden spindle running through its central axis, allowing it to be rotated and read like a rotating cylinder, a kind of ancient reference book. The text begins with a simple, profound declaration. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Kingship did not evolve. It did not rise through social contract or natural development. It descended. It came from above, a gift or an imposition from the divine realm to the mortal world. This is not the language of metaphor. This is the language of eyewitness testimony, filtered through the understanding of a people who had no other framework to describe what they had seen or heard in their ancestral traditions. The list then proceeds to name the first city to receive this heavenly kingship, Eridu, the southernmost of all the great Sumerian cities, located near what would have been the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf. Archaeological excavations at the site, known today as Tel Abu Shahrain, have revealed continuous occupation dating back to approximately 5400 BCE, making Eridu one of the oldest permanent settlements in human history. The city was dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water and creation, and it held a sacred position in Sumerian religious consciousness as the place where civilization itself began. And it is here, in this primordial city, that the King List records the reign of the first two rulers. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Then Al-Aljar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, a combined reign of 64,800 years. Stop for a moment and let that number sink in. Not 600 years, not 6,000, 64,800 years. The entire span of recorded human history, from the earliest Sumerian cities to the present day, is less than 8,000 years. Yet here, inscribed with care and precision by an ancient scroll, is a claim that just two kings ruled for 8 times that length. The list continues. After Eridu fell, the text declares, the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira, another of the sacred antediluvian cities. There 3 more kings ruled. Enmenlu-Ana reigned for 43,200 years, the longest reign of any king in the entire list. Then Enmen-Galana ruled for 28,800 years, and Dumuzid, called the Shepherd, reigned for 36,000 years. Already we are up to 5 kings and 1,200 years. From Bad Tibira, kingship moved to Larag, where Ensipadzid-Ana ruled for 28,800 years. Then to Zimbir, where Enmendu-Ana reigned for 21,000 years. Finally, to Shurupbag, where Ubara-Tutu ruled for 18,600 years. The total tally is stark and unmistakable. 8 kings ruling from 5 different cities for a combined period of 241,200 years. And then, abruptly, the list makes a declaration that changes everything. The flood swept over. This is the great dividing line in Sumerian history, the cataclysmic event that separates the mythical deep past from what gradually becomes recognizable history. The list then resumes with a new beginning. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the kingship was in Kish. Notice the language. Kingship descended a second time. The implication is clear. The flood was so catastrophic, so total, that it ended not just the reigns of individual kings, but the entire institution of kingship itself. Civilization had to be rebooted, reseeded from the heavens once more. And here is where the list becomes truly fascinating. The reigns of the post-flood kings are still extraordinarily long by any human standard, but they are dramatically shorter than those of their antediluvian predecessors. The first king of Kish after the flood ruled for some 200 years. The 23 kings of the first Kish dynasty collectively reigned for 10 years, 3 months and 3.5 days. Notice the specificity. Not just years, but months and days. This is not the language of mythology. This is the language of record-keeping, of administrative precision. As the list progresses through subsequent dynasties, the reign lengths continue to decrease. Several hundred years here, a few centuries there, and eventually we arrive at kings whose reigns are measured in decades, numbers that actually correspond to possible human lifespans. One of these later kings is a figure familiar to anyone who has studied ancient literature. Gilgamesh, the legendary hero king of Uruk, is listed as having ruled for 26 years. Now here is the critical point. Gilgamesh is not just a mythological figure, he is also a historical one. His name appears on contemporary inscriptions. The Tumul inscription, a building record from ancient Nippur, explicitly credits Gilgamesh and his son with construction work on a temple complex. Cylinder seals bearing the inscription "Servant of Gilgamesh" have been recovered, proving the existence of a functioning royal administration under that name. Most tellingly, Gilgamesh is mentioned in connection with Enma-Baragesi, a king of Kish who ruled around 2600 BCE and who is independently verified through inscriptions found at various archaeological sites. In other words, as we move forward in time through the King List, we transition from the purely mythical into the verifiable historical. But this creates a profound problem. If the later portions of the King List are demonstrably accurate, recording real kings who actually lived and ruled, then what are we to make of the earlier sections? Are we to believe that the Sumerian scribes who maintained these records with such care, who preserved them over centuries, who updated and copied them generation after generation, suddenly abandoned all pretense of accuracy when describing their most ancient past? That they simply invented wildly impossible numbers for the antediluvian kings while maintaining meticulous accuracy for later rulers? The mainstream academic explanation is that the King List is a political document, created during the Earth III period, around 2100 BCE, to legitimize the ruling dynasty by connecting them to an unbroken chain of kingship stretching back to the very beginning of time. The impossibly long reigns of the early kings, scholars argue, are purely symbolic, designed to convey an aura of deep antiquity and divine sanction to the institution of kingship itself. The numbers are mythological, not historical. They represent the worldview of people who believed that the deep past was fundamentally different from the present, an age when gods walked among men and the rules of mortal existence did not yet fully apply. This explanation is logical, it is rational, it fits comfortably within the framework of what we think we know about the ancient world, but it is also profoundly unsatisfying because it requires us to ignore certain uncomfortable facts. The first, uncomfortable fact is the precision and consistency of the numbers themselves. These are not random, inflated figures. They follow clear mathematical patterns. Most of the antediluvian reign lengths are multiples of 300, a number known in Sumerian as a sar, or multiples of 600 known as a ner, or multiples of 60 known as a sots. For example, Al-Lulim's 28,800-year reign is exactly 8 sars. Enmenlu-Ana's 43,200 years is exactly 12 sars. These are not the product of storytelling exaggeration. These are the product of a mathematical system, a deliberate encoding of information using the base 60 sexagesimal system that the Sumerians invented, and that we still use today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. The second uncomfortable fact is that the Sumerian King List is not unique. Strikingly similar records exist in other ancient cultures that had no apparent contact with Mesopotamia. The biblical book of Genesis, chapter 5, contains a genealogy of the antediluvian patriarchs, the generations from Adam to Noah, before the Great Flood. 10 patriarchs are listed, each with extraordinarily long lifespans. Adam lived 930 years, Methuselah lived 969 years, Enoch lived 360 years before he walked with God and was no more, a phrase that implies he did not die but was taken into the heavens. The total years of all 10 patriarchs combined is 8,575 years. Now this is nowhere near the 241,200 years of the Sumerian list, but the structural parallels are impossible to ignore. Both traditions record a specific number of rulers or patriarchs before a great flood. Both assign impossibly long lifespans or reign lengths to these figures. Both describe the flood as a cataclysmic break in human history, and both show a dramatic decrease in lifespans or reign lengths after the deluge. This parallel has been noted by scholars for over a century, and various explanations have been proposed. Some suggest that the biblical account borrowed from Mesopotamian tradition during the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes would have had access to such records. Others propose a common ancient Near Eastern flood tradition that both cultures independently drew upon. But here is where things get truly strange. The Hindu Puranas, sacred texts from India composed thousands of miles from Mesopotamia, also describe immense cycles of time called yugas. The Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and strife, is said to last 432,000 years. Notice that number, 432,000. The longest reign in the Sumerian King List belongs to Enmenlu-Ana at 43,200 years. The difference is a factor of exactly 10. This cannot be coincidence. The number 432 appears again and again in ancient mythology and sacred geometry. The Norse Ragnarok describes 42,000 warriors emerging from Valhalla. The Babylonian historian Berossus recorded that 42,000 years elapsed between the creation of the world and the Great Flood. The number of syllables in the Sanskrit Rig Veda is 432,000. What are we dealing with here? A universal human tendency to attach significance to certain numbers? Or evidence of a shared ancient knowledge, a common source of information about deep time and cyclical catastrophes that was somehow transmitted across cultures and continents in the distant past? The third uncomfortable fact is illogical. The cities mentioned in the antediluvian section of the King List, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, Zimbir and Shurupag, are not mythical places. They are real locations that have been excavated, and their archaeological remains confirm they are among the oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia, dating to the Ubaid period in the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. Moreover, at several of these sites, archaeologists have discovered evidence of catastrophic flooding. The most famous example is at where excavations in 2022 by Leonard Woolley revealed an 8-foot thick layer of water-deposited silt and clay, separating two distinct occupation layers. Woolley initially believed he had found evidence of the biblical flood. Later analysis by his assistant Max Mallowan showed it was almost certainly a localized flood event, not a global deluge. But the point remains. The ancient Mesopotamians lived in a land where catastrophic floods were a recurring reality, and the memory of a particularly devastating flood could easily have become enshrined in their historical records. The question is, which flood, and when did it occur? Here is where the mainstream explanation and the alternative theories diverge most dramatically. Mainstream scholarship places any historical flood event that might underlie the Sumerian tradition somewhere in the range of 2900 to 2800 BCE, based on the archaeological evidence from Ur and other sites. This would make it a significant but ultimately local disaster, perhaps the worst flood the region had experienced in recorded memory, which became mythologized over time into a world-destroying cataclysm. The alternative theories, however, propose something far more radical. They suggest that the flood recorded in the Sumerian King List is the same event recorded in dozens of other flood myths from around the world, and that this event was not a local Mesopotamian flood at all, but a genuine global catastrophe that occurred at the end of the last ice age, approximately 13,000 years ago. The evidence for such a catastrophe is mounting. Geological studies have confirmed that the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate cooling that began around 12,800 years ago, was likely triggered by a cosmic impact event, possibly fragments of a disintegrating comet striking the North American ice sheet. The impact would have caused massive wildfires, created a climate-disrupting dust cloud, and most importantly for our purposes, melted enormous volumes of glacial ice, raising sea levels by hundreds of feet and causing catastrophic flooding across the globe. If this is the flood recorded in the King List, then the antediluvian kings reigned not 5,000 years ago, but perhaps 15,000 or 20,000 or even 30,000 years ago, deep in the prehistoric past. And this is where the impossible numbers start to make a different kind of sense. Because if you accept the premise that an advanced civilization existed before this flood, a civilization that was destroyed so completely that we have found almost no trace of it, then you need a way to explain how knowledge was preserved and transmitted across the cataclysmic divide. The answer lies in the concept of the Sar, that unit of 300-600 years that appears again and again in the antediluvian rain lengths. What if the Sar is not a measure of time at all, but a code, a mathematical compression of information? Several researchers have proposed that the rain lengths in the King List are not meant to be taken literally, but are instead encrypted data, possibly recording astronomical cycles, precession periods, or even the orbital characteristics of celestial bodies. Some have suggested that the numbers, when properly decoded using Sumerian sexagesimal mathematics, yield much more reasonable timespans that actually do correspond to possible human lifespans or rain lengths. Others have gone further, proposing that the antediluvian kings were not human at all but something else entirely. This brings us to the most controversial interpretation of the Sumerian King List, the theory popularized by author Zecharia Sitchin in his groundbreaking 1976 book, The 12th Planet. Sitchin, who taught himself to read cuneiform and spent decades studying Mesopotamian texts, made a radical claim. The Sumerian gods, the Anunnaki, were not metaphysical deities but physical beings, an extraterrestrial race from a planet called Nibiru that orbits our sun on a highly elliptical path with a period of 300-600 years, precisely one Sar. According to Sitchin's interpretation, the antediluvian kings listed in the King List were not human at all. They were Anunnaki governors, ruling over early human civilization on behalf of their home world. Their extraordinarily long reigns make perfect sense if they were not bound by human lifespans. If you are a being whose natural lifespan is measured in tens of thousands of years, a reign of 28,800 years is not impossible. It is simply a long career. Sitchin argued that the flood recorded in the King List was caused by the gravitational effects of Nibiru's passage through the inner solar system, an event the Anunnaki leaders knew was coming, but chose to keep secret from the human population, intending to let the cataclysm wipe the slate clean. One Anunnaki, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, defied this decree and secretly warned a human king, variously called Zusudra in Sumerian texts, Utnapishtim in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, and Noah in the biblical tradition, instructing him to build a great boat and preserve the seed of life. After the flood receded and humanity survived, kingship descended from heaven a second time, but now the rulers were hybrids, part Anunnaki and part human, which explains why their reign lengths are much shorter than the pure Anunnaki kings who came before. As the hybrid bloodlines became more diluted over successive generations, lifespans continued to decrease until they reached the normal human range we see in the later parts of the King List. Now, Sitchin's theories have been almost universally rejected by mainstream academia. Scholars point out that his translations of Sumerian texts are idiosyncratic and often based on forcing the evidence to fit his preconceived theory. Astronomers note that there is no evidence for a massive planet on a 3,600-year orbit, and that such an orbit would be dynamically unstable and would have left obvious gravitational signatures on the outer planets. Biologists argue that the very concept of human-alien hybridization is scientifically implausible without extraordinary genetic engineering far beyond anything we can currently achieve. Yet despite these criticisms, Sitchin's work resonates with millions of readers because it offers a compelling, comprehensive explanation for some very real mysteries. Why do the oldest civilizations seem to appear suddenly already sophisticated, as if someone had taught them agriculture, writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture? Why do so many ancient cultures, from Sumer to Egypt to Mesoamerica, share similar myths of gods descending from the sky to establish civilization? Why do the Sumerians themselves, in their own texts, explicitly state that kingship was not a human invention but a gift from above? Whether you accept Sitchin's extraterrestrial hypothesis or not, one thing is undeniable. The Sumerian King List is not a simple myth. It is a complex, carefully structured document that follows consistent mathematical principles and preserves a tradition that the Sumerians themselves took very seriously. They did not treat it as fiction, they treated it as history. So let us examine the numbers more closely. When scholars analyse the antediluvian reign lengths, they discover something fascinating. If you add up all 8 reigns and express the total in the sexagesimal system, you get a very specific pattern. The sum of Topsumtavons and Faldown 200 years can be expressed as Temerson multiplied by 3600. Now compare this to the biblical genealogy in Genesis 5. If you add up the lifespans of the 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, excluding Adam and Noah themselves to get 8 patriarchs, which matches the 8 Sumerian kings, and if you round the ages to 2 significant digits as the Sumerian scribes did, you get a total of 6,600 years, which can be expressed in decimal notation as 6 multiplied by 10 cubed, plus 6 multiplied by 10 squared, plus 0 multiplied by 10. Now here is the key. If a scribe or translator, working sometime in the distant past, encountered the biblical numbers and mistakenly interpreted them as being written in the sexagesimal rather than the decimal system, the result would be mathematically equivalent to the Sumerian total. This extraordinary numerical correspondence was first noted by researcher Raul Lopez Corredwara and has led some scholars to propose that both traditions, the Sumerian and the biblical, are drawing on a common source, a shared ancient document that recorded the actual lifespans or reign lengths of rulers from before the flood. The source document may have been damaged or difficult to read, and different scribes interpreting it in different numerical systems produced the divergent numbers we see today. If this hypothesis is correct, it has profound implications. It means that somewhere, perhaps in the ruins of a Mesopotamian city still waiting to be excavated, there may exist a more original version of the King List, one that contains the true numbers, the actual lifespans or reign lengths that both the Sumerian and biblical traditions are imperfect copies of. But there is another pattern hidden in the numbers, one that is even more intriguing. Many of the reign lengths are not just multiples of 3,600, but also relate to significant astronomical cycles. The number 25920 is the approximate length in years of one complete precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars at the spring equinox to shift through the zodiac over a period of nearly 26,000 years. This number and fractions of it appear repeatedly in ancient mythology and sacred architecture. The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, incorporates precise astronomical alignments and mathematical ratios that encode the precession cycle. The Hindu yugas are also based on precessional periods, and when we examine the Sumerian reign lengths, we find that several of them, 43 to 200 and 28 to 800 in particular, are significant fractions of 25920. Is it possible that the antediluvian kings were not individuals at all, but dynasties or eras, and that their reign lengths are actually encoding astronomical time periods? Perhaps the King List is not a chronicle of individual rulers, but a sophisticated astronomical text, a record of celestial cycles observed over thousands of years by an advanced civilization that understood the mechanics of the heavens far better than we have given them credit for. This interpretation would explain why the numbers are so precise, why they follow mathematical patterns, and why similar numbers appear in other ancient traditions. They are all preserving the same astronomical knowledge, the same understanding of deep time and cyclical change. Yet even this explanation leaves questions unanswered. If the King List is primarily an astronomical document, why frame it as a chronicle of kings? Why attach these numbers to specific named individuals and specific cities? And why make such a clear distinction between the antediluvian period and the post-flood period? The most likely answer is that the truth is more complex than any single theory can capture. The King List is simultaneously a political document, a religious text, an astronomical record, and a genuine historical chronicle, all layered together in a way that reflects the Sumerian worldview, where politics, religion, astronomy, and history were not separate domains but interwoven aspects of a unified reality. To the Sumerian scribes who created and maintained this document, there was no contradiction in recording that a king ruled for 28 to 800 years, because time itself was understood differently. The linear, mechanistic concept of time that we take for granted today, where one year simply follows another in an unchanging rhythm, was not how the ancient world thought. Time was cyclical, nested, qualitative. A year in the age of gods, the deep antediluvian past, was not the same as a year in the age of men. The Sa, the 300-year period, may represent an entirely different order of time, a cosmic year measured by the return of a celestial body, the completion of a precessional cycle, or some other astronomical phenomenon we have not yet identified. What we can say with certainty is that the Sumerian King List preserves something profound. Whether it is a literal historical record, an encoded astronomical text, a mythologized memory of a lost civilization, or all three simultaneously, it stands as testament to a sophistication and continuity of tradition far deeper than we have been willing to acknowledge. Consider this. The Weltblundel prism itself, the most complete copy we have, was created around 1800 BCE, but it was copied from earlier sources, which were copied from still earlier sources. The tradition it records stretches back at least to the Earth Three period, around 2100 BCE, and likely much further. The cities it names, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, existed as real urban centres by 4000 BCE. If the antediluvian kings are not mythical but represent a real tradition of kingship in these cities, then we are looking at a historical memory that extends back at least 6,000 years, possibly much more, and the Sumerians themselves believed it extended back over 240,000 years. The conventional dismissal of the King List as pure mythology rests on a single assumption: that humans in the deep past were primitive, that complex civilization only arose within the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, and that anything claiming greater antiquity must therefore be fantasy. But what if that assumption is wrong? Recent archaeological discoveries are forcing us to reconsider that timeline. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex built around 9600 BCE, demonstrates that hunter-gatherers were capable of sophisticated monumental architecture and complex social organization thousands of years before the supposed invention of agriculture and civilization. The site features precisely carved stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols. This was not built by primitive nomads. This was built by a society with advanced organisational capabilities, specialised labour, and possibly a system of writing or proto-writing we have not yet deciphered. Then there are the megalithic structures scattered across the globe, from the massive stone blocks of Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons, and still defying explanation of how they were quarried, transported and placed, to the precisely fitted polygonal masonry at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, to the enigmatic stone spheres of Costa Rica, perfect spheres of granite up to 8 feet in diameter whose purpose remains unknown. Mainstream archaeology assigns these to various known ancient cultures, but there is a growing recognition that we may be missing an earlier chapter, an older civilization whose works became the foundation upon which later cultures built. The Sumerian King List may be one of the few textual records of this lost world. One of the most striking features of the antediluvian section is the names of the kings themselves. These are not typical Sumerian names from the historical period. They have an archaic quality, and several of them are compound words that describe attributes or roles rather than personal names. Alulim, the first king, may mean man of the stag. Al-Aljar could be translated as bright one. Enmenlu Ana means lord of the powers of heaven, or the lord of the shepherds of heaven. Enmengalana translates to lord of the great powers of heaven. Dumuzid, the shepherd, is explicitly given a title rather than just a name. These sound less like personal names and more like descriptions of functional status. What if they are not the names of individuals at all, but titles of office, roles within a highly structured society, whose kings bore descriptive titles, the way later Roman emperors bore titles like Augustus or Imperator? Or what if they are, as some have suggested, the names not of humans but of the Anunnaki gods themselves, ruling directly over the first cities before the flood, with the text simply recording the duration of their time in power? This interpretation would align with other Sumerian texts where the gods are depicted as physically present, dwelling in their temples, interacting with humans, making decisions that affect the earthly realm. The boundary between god and king, between divine and mortal, was far more fluid in the Sumerian worldview than it is in ours. The enigma deepens when we examine what happens after the flood. The text states that kingship descended from heaven a second time and was established in Kish. The first post-flood dynasty of Kish contains 23 kings who collectively ruled for 24-10 years, 3 months and 3.5 days. Already we see a dramatic reduction. Where the 8 antediluvian kings averaged over 30,000 years each, the post-flood kings averaged just over 1,000 years. And as we continue through the list, through subsequent dynasties in different cities, the reigns continue to shorten. Within a few more dynasties, we are down to reign lengths of a few hundred years, then a few decades. Then we reach kings like Gilgamesh with his 126 years, still extraordinarily long, but at least approaching the realm of biological possibility, especially if we allow for exaggeration or a different method of calculating years. The pattern is unmistakable. A clear mathematical decline, a gradual return to normal human lifespans over the course of many generations. This pattern is precisely what you would expect if the post-flood population was a hybrid, part divine and part human, with the divine element becoming more diluted with each passing generation. It is also what you would expect if the numbering system itself was gradually changing, transitioning from one method of timekeeping to another, or it could reflect a genuine historical memory of a period when, for whatever reason, whether environmental, nutritional or genetic, human lifespans were significantly longer than they are today, and gradually decreased to modern norms. There is some scientific support for this last possibility. Studies of human DNA have revealed that there was a genetic bottleneck in human population around 70,000 years ago, possibly caused by the eruption of the Toba supervolcano, which reduced the human population to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals. After such a bottleneck, genetic diversity is severely reduced, and this can lead to both increased susceptibility to disease and, paradoxically, in certain lineages, increased longevity if the surviving population carried advantageous genetic variants. It is not impossible that in the aftermath of a catastrophic event, a small surviving population might have had unusual longevity, which decreased as they intermixed with other human groups or as environmental conditions changed. But let us return to the document itself and the cities it names. The 5 antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, Zimbir and Shurapak, form an interesting geographical pattern. They are all located in what is now southern Iraq, in the region that was once the heartland of ancient Sumer. Eridu was the southernmost, located near what would have been the ancient coastline of the Persian Gulf, which was much further inland during the post-glacial period than it is today. Bad Tibira was to the north of Eridu. Larag, also called Larsa, was further north still. Zimbir, identified with the ancient city of Sippar, was much further north, closer to modern Baghdad, and Shurapak, known from the Epic of Gilgamesh as the city of the flood hero Utnapishtim, was in the central region. What is significant is that these are not random cities. Archaeological evidence confirms they were among the very oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia, dating to the Ubaid period and earlier. They form a kind of network, a constellation of the most ancient sacred sites, and the King List is asserting that kingship moved between them in a specific sequence before the flood destroyed this antediluvian civilization. After the flood, the pattern changes. Kingship is established in Kish, which is much further north, near modern Babylon. From there it moves to Uruk back in the south, then to Ur, then back north to various cities, in a seemingly chaotic pattern that scholars believe reflects the actual political history of the early dynastic period when different cities competed for hegemony. This shift from the orderly antediluvian pattern to the chaotic post-flood pattern may reflect a genuine historical transition from a unified pre-flood civilization to the fractured city-state system of the early dynastic period. Or it may simply reflect the fact that the scribes who created the King List had reliable historical records for the later periods, but only fragmentary, mythologized traditions for the earlier periods. One of the most controversial aspects of the King List is the question of overlap. Scholars have long recognized that many of the dynasties recorded as consecutive were in fact contemporary, ruling in different cities at the same time. The King List presents a fiction of continuous linear succession when the reality was messier and more complex. But here is the puzzle. If the scribes knew this, if they had access to records showing that certain kings were contemporaries, why present them as consecutive? The answer, most scholars believe, is political. The King List was created to legitimize the ruling dynasty of Earth by presenting them as the inheritors of an unbroken line of kingship stretching back to the gods themselves. To achieve this, all previous dynasties had to be presented as links in a single chain, even if the historical reality was more complicated. But there is another possibility, one that the mainstream rarely considers. What if the antediluvian portion of the list is not contemporary with the post-flood portion? What if those 8 kings with their impossible reign lengths actually ruled consecutively, in a linear succession, during a period of history so remote that there was only one centre of kingship, one ruling authority over a unified civilization? In this view, the pattern shifts from consecutive to overlapping precisely at the flood, because the flood destroyed the old unified order and ushered in the fragmented city-state system where multiple kings ruled simultaneously in different cities. This interpretation has a certain elegance. It explains why the antediluvian kings are presented as a simple linear sequence while the post-flood kings are a tangled web of overlapping dynasties. It suggests that the pre-flood world was fundamentally different, not just mythologically but politically and socially, a world of order that gave way to chaos. Let us address the elephant in the room, the question everyone asks when confronted with the Sumerian King List. Could the antediluvian kings have been real? Is it physically possible for any being to live and rule for tens of thousands of years? The answer, based on everything we understand about biology, is no. Human beings do not and cannot live that long. Our cells have a built-in limit to the number of times they can divide, known as the Hayflick limit, which puts a hard cap on human lifespan at around 20 years under ideal conditions. We have genetic and environmental factors that cause aging, disease, and eventually death. There is no biological mechanism by which a human could live for 2800 years, much less rule a kingdom coherently for that length of time. But here is where the alternative theories diverge from biological orthodoxy. What if the antediluvian kings were not biological humans? What if they were, as Sitchin proposed, extraterrestrial beings with lifespans measured in tens of thousands of years? Or what if they were, as other researchers have suggested, artificial intelligences, machine consciousnesses housed in durable physical forms that could persist for millennia while human societies rose and fell around them? Or what if they were, in the language of the ancients themselves, gods, beings of a different order of existence, not bound by the same physical laws that govern mortal flesh? These proposals sound like science fiction, but it is worth noting that the Sumerians themselves did not think of their gods as abstract metaphysical entities. The gods were physical beings who lived in temples, ate food that was offered to them, made journeys from one city to another, engaged in sexual relationships, had children, fought wars, and could be seen and interacted with by humans, albeit rarely and under special circumstances. The distinction between a god and an exceptionally powerful, long-lived being is not as clear in the Sumerian worldview as it is in ours. So when the King List says that 8 kings ruled for 241 to 200 years before the flood, we need to ask who is making this claim. It is not some anonymous myth maker, some primitive storyteller inventing fables around a campfire. It is the official scribes of the Ur-3 dynasty, the same scribes who accurately recorded the reigns of historical kings, the same scribes who maintained administrative records, commercial transactions, legal documents. These were the accountants, the bureaucrats, the keepers of records for one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. And they treated the antediluvian section of the King List with the same seriousness, the same administrative precision, as they treated the historical sections. They even went to the effort of specifying the exact number of cities, 8 kings, ruled 200 years. This is not the language of myth. This is the language of data, of preserved information. Whether that information is accurate or not is another question, but it was clearly intended to be taken as factual by the scribes who recorded it. There is one more piece of evidence we must consider, and it is perhaps the most tantalizing of all. In 2018, researchers analysing ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains in the Near East made a startling discovery. The genetic data revealed evidence of what they described as an unknown archaic hominin that interbred with the ancestors of modern humans from somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 years ago. This was not Neanderthal DNA. It was not Denisovan DNA. It was something else, a ghost population that left its mark on our genome, but whose physical remains have not been identified. What if this archaic hominin was not primitive at all? What if it was, in fact, highly advanced? And what if the legends of the antediluvian kings preserve a cultural memory of this lost people? A branch of the human family tree that achieved civilization long before Homo sapiens, and whose survivors, after some catastrophe, intermixed with our ancestors, passing on knowledge, genes, and the seeds of civilization. This is speculation, but it is speculation grounded in real genetic data. We know for a fact that our ancestors interbreed with other species or subspecies of humans. We know that some of these other humans were cognitively sophisticated, creating art, tools, and possibly language. Is it such a leap to imagine that some of them might have also created cities, governments, and written records of their own, records that were later adopted and adapted by our own ancestors who inherited their world? The Sumerian King List may be our only surviving glimpse into that lost world, a world that existed tens of thousands of years before the Sumerians themselves, preserved in their texts because they recognized it as their own origin story, their own account of where kingship and perhaps humanity itself came from. So what is the truth behind the Sumerian King List? The honest answer is that we do not know. We have a document that is simultaneously historical and mythological, precise and impossible, rational and absurd. We have an archaeological record that confirms the cities, finds traces of the floods, and verifies the later kings, but falls shallow when we push back beyond the horizon of recorded history. We have mathematical patterns that suggest deliberate encoding of information, but we do not know what information was being encoded or why. We have genetic evidence of lost human populations, geological evidence of catastrophic floods, and mythological traditions from around the world that all point to the same theme. A lost golden age, a great cataclysm, a handful of survivors who rebuilt civilization from the ruins. The Sumerian King List stands at the intersection of all these mysteries, a Rosetta Stone that we have not yet fully learned to read. Perhaps the truth is not a single answer, but a layered one. Perhaps the antediluvian kings were real individuals, leaders of a lost civilization, whose reigns have been encoded in astronomical time units that make them appear impossibly long. Perhaps they were Anunnaki overlords, extraterrestrial governors whose true lifespan seemed godlike to the humans they ruled. Perhaps they were mythological projections, the Sumerian answer to the question of where kingship came from, an origin story that placed it beyond human invention, in the realm of the divine. Or perhaps, most provocatively, all three explanations are true simultaneously, different facets of the same complex historical reality, a reality where humans, gods, and something in between all played a role in the deep past. What we can say with certainty is that the Sumerian King List is not random. It is not arbitrary. It is a carefully structured document that follows clear patterns and preserves a tradition that was taken seriously by one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. They carved it in stone and clay. They copied it and recopied it across centuries. They updated it as new dynasties rose and fell. They treated it as a foundational document, a record of legitimacy and continuity. And then, sometime around the first millennium BCE, it stopped being updated. The tradition lapsed. The memory faded. The list was buried in the ruins of forgotten cities, and for over 2,000 years, humanity forgot that it had ever existed. Until a German-American scholar, sitting in a museum in England, began to piece together broken clay fragments, and the story emerged once more into the light. Today, the Weld-Blundell prism sits in a climate-controlled case at the Ashmolean Museum. You can visit it. You can see the cuneiform with your own eyes, the wedge-shaped impressions left by a reed stylus in soft clay nearly 4,000 years ago. And you can read the words, "After the kingship descended from heaven, 8 kings ruled 200 years. The flood swept over." What those words truly mean, what history they actually record, remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. And perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain just beyond our grasp, pulling us forward, generation after generation, compelling us to dig deeper, to question our assumptions, to consider possibilities that seem impossible, to remember that our understanding of the past is always incomplete, always subject to revision, as new evidence emerges from the ground or new insights illuminate old texts in unexpected ways. The Sumerian King List is a testament to human memory and human ambition. Whether it records literal history or encoded wisdom, whether it speaks of gods or kings or something in between, it stands as proof that someone, thousands of years ago, cared enough about preserving the past to create this document, to give it mathematical precision, to embed it with layers of meaning that we are still trying to unpack today. And it reminds us that our own civilization is not the first to rise to heights of sophistication and knowledge. Before us came the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Before them came the Sumerians. And before the Sumerians, the King List has an answer to that question. It says that before the flood, before the fragmentation into city-states, before the historical dynasties we can verify and measure, there was a different world. A world of unimaginable age where kings ruled for thousands upon thousands of years. A world that ended in water and chaos and was reborn into the history we recognize today. Whether that answer is literal truth, symbolic wisdom, or something stranger still, it continues to call to us, across the millennia, whispering its impossible numbers, challenging us to explain them away or to accept them for what they claim to be. A record of the time before time. A chronicle of 200 years when the first kings walked the earth. The flood swept over, but the memory survived, and now the mystery is yours to ponder. But there is more to this story, much more, and to understand the full significance of the Sumerian King List, we must examine it in the context of what the Sumerians themselves believed about their origins and the nature of reality. We must look at the other texts they left behind, the myths and epics that provide additional layers of meaning to the bare chronology of the King List. And we must confront the uncomfortable questions that arise when we take these ancient records seriously, not as primitive superstition, but as genuine attempts to preserve historical memory in the only terms available to a people who lived thousands of years ago. The Sumerians were obsessed with beginnings. They created numerous texts attempting to explain the origins of civilization, the gods, humanity, and the world itself. One of the most important of these is the Eridu Genesis, sometimes called the Sumerian creation myth, fragments of which have been recovered from various sites. This text describes how the gods created humanity to relieve themselves of hard labour, how cities were established as divine gifts, and how a great flood was sent to destroy humanity when they became too numerous and too noisy. The flood hero in this version is named Zusudra, and he is explicitly identified as a king, the pious, God-fearing king who ruled for thousands of years. After the flood, the text says Zusudra was granted eternal life and taken to live in a distant land, the land of crossing, where the sun rises. This is the same basic narrative we find in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is called Utnapishtim, and in the Atrahasis epic, where he is called Atrahasis. All three versions agree on the essential facts. There was a flood, a king was warned, he built a boat, humanity survived, and the flood marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. What makes the Eridu Genesis particularly interesting is that it provides context for the King List. It explains why there is such a dramatic break at the flood and why the post-flood kings have shorter reigns. According to the text, after the flood, the gods decided to limit human lifespans because the unchecked growth of population had been part of what caused the original problem. This is remarkably similar to the biblical narrative where God declares after the flood that human lifespans will be limited to 120 years. Both traditions preserve the idea that something fundamental changed at the flood, that the pre-flood world operated under different rules. But here is what is fascinating. Neither tradition treats this as purely symbolic. Both present it as a historical fact. The flood happened. The lifespans changed. The world was different before. This is stated as plainly as any historical event. Now, a skeptic might say, this is simply how ancient peoples explained the obvious fact that no one lives for thousands of years anymore, that they invented a pre-flood golden age to explain why the old tales spoke of impossibly long-lived ancestors. But that explanation assumes the ancient writers were consciously fabricating, that they knew the stories were false and were creating explanatory mythology to justify them. The texts themselves give no indication of this. They present the information straightforwardly, matter-of-factly as known history. Consider the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest and most famous works of literature in human history. The epic has been recovered in multiple versions, from Sumerian poems dating to around 2100 BCE to the famous Akkadian Standard Babylonian version, compiled by the scribe Sinleki-Unini around 1200 BCE. The story follows Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, on his quest for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu. The epic is notable for many reasons, but one of the most significant is how it bridges the mythological and the historical. Gilgamesh himself appears in the Sumerian King List as a historical figure, ruling for 126 years, and his name appears in contemporary inscriptions from his own time period, confirming his historical existence. Yet the epic describes him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, born of the goddess Ninsun and the deified king Lugalbanda. It describes his superhuman strength, his ability to travel vast distances without rest, his confrontation with divine beings and monsters. The question this poses is stark. If Gilgamesh was a real king, and we know he was, then how much of the rest is real? Were there really monsters? Were there really gods walking the earth? Or is the epic a mythologized biography, taking a historical figure and embellishing his story with fantastic elements? The mainstream view is the latter. Gilgamesh was a powerful king, perhaps the greatest of the early dynastic period, and his exploits were so impressive that they became legendary, with each retelling adding more fantastic elements until the historical man became a semi-divine hero. This is a reasonable interpretation. It is how oral tradition typically works, but there is a problem. The epic itself does not read like exaggerated folktale, it reads like someone trying to preserve historical information. The prologue to the standard Babylonian version explicitly states that Gilgamesh saw the deep, meaning he gained secret knowledge of the time before the flood, and that he brought back a report of the days before the deluge. He is described as the one who knew everything, who had seen all things from the edge of the world. This is not the language of myth-making. This is the language of testimony, of claiming that Gilgamesh had access to knowledge about the deep past and that his story contains important historical information. And what is that information? In Tablet 11, Gilgamesh reaches the far shore of the cosmic ocean and meets Utnapishtim, the immortal flood hero. Utnapishtim then recounts the story of the flood, and his account is so detailed, so specific, that it has been called one of the earliest examples of historical narrative. He describes the build specifications of the boat, exactly square in design, with 6 decks dividing it into 7 levels, its walls covered with bitumen for waterproofing. He describes how he loaded it with gold, silver, the seed of all living things, his family, and his craftsmen. He describes the 7 days and nights of the storm, how even the gods were terrified by its violence, how afterward the landscape was completely flat and all humanity had turned to clay. This is not poetic metaphor. This is someone describing a real event with technical precision. The parallels between Utnapishtim's flood narrative and the biblical story of Noah are so exact that when George Smith first translated Tablet 11 in 1872, It caused a sensation that reached all the way to the British Prime Minister. Here was proof that the biblical flood was not original, that it was drawing on much older Mesopotamian traditions. But what scholars often overlook in their focus on the literary parallels is the historical claim embedded in both texts. The claim that there was a real flood, a specific event in time that divided human history into before and after. And crucially, the claim that information from before the flood was preserved and transmitted to the post-flood world. How? The Epic of Gilgamesh provides the answer. According to the prologue, Gilgamesh brought back knowledge of the days before the deluge and recorded it on a stone tablet. The implication is clear. The antediluvian knowledge, the history of the pre-flood world, survived because someone wrote it down on a durable medium and hid it somewhere it would survive the flood. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated concept. It suggests that the Sumerians understood that information could be preserved across catastrophic events through the use of durable storage media, and that they believed this had actually happened, that tablets or stelae from before the flood had been discovered and translated by post-flood humans. Is this fantasy? Or is it a genuine tradition preserving the memory of how knowledge was actually transmitted across the disaster? Archaeological evidence suggests that knowledge preservation was indeed a major concern of ancient cultures. The Sumerians invented writing specifically to preserve information, to create permanent records that would outlast individual lifespans. They baked their tablets to make them fireproof and buried them in temple foundations where they would be protected. They created king lists and chronologies precisely to maintain continuity with the past. Is it so implausible that an earlier civilization, facing an impending catastrophe, would have attempted the same thing, carving their most important knowledge onto stone or clay and storing it in locations where it might survive? And if such antediluvian tablets were later discovered by the Sumerians, how would they have understood them? They would have seen the same cuneiform script they used themselves, or something similar, because the script would have been the ancestor of their own writing system. They would have been able to read the numbers, the names, the chronology, and they would have incorporated this information into their own records, creating the composite document we now know as the Sumerian King List, a document that is part archaeological discovery and part contemporary record. This interpretation explains many of the puzzles surrounding the list. It explains why the antediluvian section feels different, why the numbers are so large, why the names are so archaic. This section is based on much older source material, perhaps tablets that were hundreds or even thousands of years old when the Ur-3 scribes copied them. The post-flood sections, by contrast, are based on contemporary administrative records, the actual year-by-year chronicles maintained by each city-state. The King List is therefore a hybrid document, stitching together antediluvian archives with historical records to create a continuous narrative from the beginning of time to the present day. Now let us turn to one of the most persistent mysteries of the King List, the mathematics. Why are the numbers the way they are? We have already noted that most of the antediluvian reigns are multiples of 3, 600 or 000 or 60, the fundamental units of the Sumerian sexagesimal system. But there is another pattern that scholars have only recently begun to appreciate. The total sum of 241 200 years is not random. It is sometimes 300. Why 67? Some researchers have pointed out that Sen is a prime number, suggesting it was chosen for mathematical or mystical significance. Others note that Sen years is close to the average human lifespan in ancient times, leading to speculation that the 3600-year Sar might represent a generation or dynasty measured in some other time scale. Still others have suggested that the number encodes astronomical information. The precession of the equinoxes takes approximately 2520 years for a complete cycle. If you divide 240 by 25,020, you get approximately 9.3, which is close to the number of precessional months in a cycle if you divide the great year into 12 houses of the zodiac. This has led some researchers to propose that the King List is actually an astronomical text, recording observations of the precession cycle and other long-term celestial patterns. The individual reign lengths would then correspond to periods when certain celestial bodies were in specific configurations, with the reigns named after the astronomers or priest-kings who made the observations. This theory has some merit. The Babylonians, who inherited the Sumerian astronomical tradition, were incredibly sophisticated observers of the heavens. They could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They track the movements of planets over decades and centuries, and they understood mathematical principles that would not be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. If the Babylonians had this knowledge, where did they get it? They claim they got it from the Sumerians. And where did the Sumerians get it? The Sumerians themselves claim they got it from the antediluvian sages, the Apkallu semi-divine beings who brought civilization to humanity before the flood. According to Sumerian and Babylonian tradition, there were 7 Apkallu who served as advisors to the antediluvian kings. These were not humans but fishmen, beings who emerged from the sea to teach humanity writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and the arts of civilization. The first and greatest of these was Adapa, also known as Uan or Oannes, who was said to have served the first king, Alulim. Adapa is a fascinating figure. Like Gilgamesh, he is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He was given wisdom by the god Enki, but was tricked out of receiving immortality. He is credited with bringing all knowledge to humanity, and his story has remarkable parallels with various biblical figures, particularly Enoch, who also walked with God and was taken up without dying. The tradition of the 7 antediluvian sages is preserved in multiple texts and was taken very seriously by Mesopotamian scribes across thousands of years. After the flood, the tradition says, new sages appeared, but they were fully human, no longer the semi-divine Apkallu of the old world. This again points to a fundamental break at the flood, a transition from one order of reality to another. What are we to make of these fishmen sages? Mainstream scholars interpret them as mythological symbols of the sea-based trade and cultural exchange that brought new ideas and technologies to early Mesopotamia. The fish imagery, they argue, represents foreigners arriving by boat bringing knowledge from elsewhere. This is plausible. But it does not fully explain why the tradition is so specific, why it names 7 particular individuals, why it associates each with particular kings and particular accomplishments, and why it insists these beings were not human. The alternative interpretation is more literal. The Apkallu were real beings, not entirely human, who served as advisors and teachers to the antediluvian kings. They had knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering far beyond what early humans possessed naturally, and they transferred this knowledge deliberately, jump-starting human civilization. After the flood, this species or race or order of beings was gone, and humans had to continue on their own with only the knowledge the Apkallu had given them. This interpretation sounds like ancient astronaut theory, and indeed it is one of the foundations of that hypothesis. But it is worth noting that you do not need to invoke extraterrestrials to make sense of this tradition. You only need to accept the possibility of a highly advanced pre-flood human civilization, one that had reached a level of sophistication comparable to our own. If such a civilization existed and was destroyed in a catastrophic flood, the survivors, the few who had prepared and preserved knowledge, would have appeared godlike to the primitive populations they encountered in the post-flood world. They would have had technology, writing, mathematics, astronomy, knowledge that seemed magical. They would have been remembered as semi-divine teachers, as seers who brought civilization out of the darkness. And over thousands of years, as their true origins were forgotten, they would have been transformed in collective memory into mythological beings, fishmen, emerging from the sea, divine messengers descending from heaven. This brings us to one of the most controversial proposals regarding the Sumerian King List and the antediluvian period, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. For decades, scientists have known that approximately 12,800 years ago, Earth's climate underwent a sudden and dramatic shift. After thousands of years of gradual warming as the last ice age ended, temperatures suddenly plunged back into near glacial conditions in what is known as the Younger Dryas period. This cold snap lasted for approximately 100-200 years before ending as abruptly as it began, with temperatures rising by up to 7 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. For years, the cause of this event was unknown. Various theories were proposed, including disruption of ocean currents by glacial meltwater, volcanic eruptions, or the changes in solar radiation. Then, in 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published evidence for what they called the Younger Dryas impact event. According to their hypothesis, Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet around 12,800 years ago. The impacts occurred primarily in North America but affected the entire planet. The evidence includes a thin layer of sediment dated to the Younger Dryas boundary that contains high concentrations of nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium, and other materials associated with extraterrestrial impacts. This layer has now been found at more than 50 sites across North America, Europe, and Asia. The impacts would have caused massive wildfires, evidenced by a spike in carbon particles and soot in the geological record. They would have created a dust cloud that blocked sunlight, causing rapid cooling. Most importantly for our purposes, they would have caused catastrophic floods by melting portions of the North American ice sheet and raising sea levels rapidly. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains controversial in mainstream geology, with some scientists questioning the evidence and proposing alternative explanations. But a growing body of research supports the basic premise that Earth experienced a cosmic catastrophe at the end of the last ice age. And this catastrophe occurred at exactly the right time to be the flood recorded in the Sumerian King List and numerous other ancient traditions. If the antediluvian kings really did rule before this event, then their civilization would have existed during the late Paleolithic, a period when mainstream archaeology insists that humans were still hunter-gatherers with no cities, no writing, no organised kingdoms. But what if mainstream archaeology is wrong? What if the discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe, a sophisticated temple complex built by supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers around 9600 BCE, is just the tip of the iceberg? What if there were cities, kingdoms, and advanced civilizations during the Ice Age, built along the coastlines that are now hundreds of feet underwater, and the Younger Dryas impact destroyed them utterly? In this scenario, the survivors would have fled inland to higher ground, bringing with them whatever knowledge and records they could carry. They would have established new settlements in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. They would have taught the local populations agriculture, mathematics, writing, and the other arts of civilization. They would have told stories of the old world, of the great kings who ruled for thousands of years, of the gods who walked among men, of the catastrophic flood that ended it all. And these stories would have been preserved, generation after generation, until they were finally written down in cuneiform on clay tablets by Sumerian scribes 4,000 years ago, creating the document we now know as the Sumerian King List. This interpretation requires us to radically revise our understanding of human prehistory. It requires us to accept that civilization is much older than we thought, that it has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, and that the myths and legends we have dismissed as primitive superstition are actually preserving real historical memories. It is a controversial proposal, it challenges academic orthodoxy, but it is not without evidence. The geological evidence for a catastrophic flood at the end of the Ice Age is substantial. The genetic evidence for dramatic population bottlenecks and migrations in human history is undeniable. The archaeological evidence for sophisticated structures and complex societies far earlier than previously believed continues to accumulate. And the textual evidence, documents like the Sumerian King List that claim to record events from the deep past, is sitting in museums around the world, waiting for us to take it seriously. So let us take it seriously. Let us examine what the King List actually says and compare it to what we know from other sources. The King List says that 8 kings ruled before the flood from 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, Zimbir, and Shurapak. These cities, as we have noted, are real places with archaeological remains dating to the Ubaid period and earlier. They are among the oldest urban settlements in Mesopotamia. Could they be even older than currently believed? Could they be the successors to earlier cities that were destroyed in the flood? Archaeological dating is not an exact science. It relies on assumptions about stratigraphy, carbon-14 decay rates, and the correlation of artifacts with known chronological sequences. These assumptions are generally reliable for recent periods, but become increasingly uncertain as we go further back in time. It is not impossible that the deepest levels of these ancient sites, the levels that have not yet been fully excavated or have been damaged by erosion and flooding, could date to much earlier periods than currently accepted. The King List says that Alalim, the first king, ruled from Eridu. Eridu was the sacred city of Enki, the god of wisdom and water. It was located near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf, which has advanced significantly since the end of the last ice age due to rising sea levels. Much of the land that was once the southern coast of Mesopotamia is now underwater. Could there be older cities, older settlements, beneath the Persian Gulf? In 2010, archaeologist Geoffrey Rose proposed exactly this, suggesting that the Persian Gulf basin, which was dry land during the Ice Age, was home to a sophisticated culture he called the Persian Gulf Oasis. This culture, he argued, was the source of the agricultural and urban revolution that later appeared in Mesopotamia and elsewhere. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, drowning the Persian Gulf basin, the population fled to higher ground, establishing new settlements in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula. This fits remarkably well with the tradition of the antediluvian cities. Eridu, the first city according to the King List, would have been on the edge of this Persian Gulf oasis, one of the last settlements before the highlands. When the floods came, Eridu would have been one of the last places to survive before the entire basin was inundated. The memory of this disaster would have been preserved, and the cities that came before, the ones now underwater, would have been remembered as the legendary antediluvian cities ruled by the great kings of old. This interpretation makes the King List a historical document, preserving a genuine memory of real places and real events, but encoding them in terms that reflect a different understanding of time, kingship, and the divine. The 8 kings are not individuals but dynasties, each ruling for many generations. The numbers are not years, but some other unit of time, possibly generations, or they have been inflated through repeated copying and reinterpretation over thousands of years. The flood is not a myth, but a real geological event, the drowning of the Persian Gulf basin at the end of the last ice age. Kingship descended from heaven because the original kings were survivors from the flooded lowlands, appearing as if from nowhere to the highland populations, bringing with them the knowledge and technology of the lost civilization. There is one final piece of evidence we must examine, and it may be the most important of all, the mysterious end of the King List. The Weld-Blundell prism, our most complete copy, ends with the reign of Sin-Magir of the Isin dynasty, around 1827 to 1817 BCE. This is a specific datable period in Mesopotamian history, and it appears that the prism was created during or shortly after Sin-Magir's reign. But why does it end there? Why did the Sumerian scribes stop updating the King List after centuries of careful maintenance? The most likely answer is that the Isin dynasty was the last to effectively claim legitimacy through the King List tradition. After Isin, power fragmented further, with multiple kingdoms and empires rising and falling in rapid succession. The Babylonians, the Kassites, the Assyrians, each had their own royal chronicles and did not rely on the old Sumerian King List tradition to justify their rule. The tradition simply became obsolete, a relic of an earlier age when the unity of Mesopotamian kingship was still a meaningful political concept. But there is another darker possibility. The tradition ended because the knowledge it preserved was deliberately suppressed. By the time of Babylon and Assyria, the old Sumerian language was dying out, understood only by scholars and priests. The cuneiform script was being replaced by alphabetic writing systems. The political and religious landscape was changing. New gods, new kingdoms, new ways of understanding the world were emerging. The old traditions, with their claims about antediluvian kings and godlike beings ruling for tens of thousands of years, were becoming an embarrassment, a contradiction to the new worldview. And so they were quietly set aside, forgotten, buried in temple foundations where they would not trouble the new order. This is not mere speculation. We have historical examples of knowledge being suppressed, texts being destroyed, traditions being erased, because they conflicted with the dominant ideology. The Library of Alexandria was burned. The Mayan codices were destroyed by Spanish conquistadors. Countless oral traditions were lost when colonizers suppressed indigenous cultures. The Sumerian King List may have been a victim of the same process, deliberately forgotten, because its claims were too inconvenient, too challenging to the emerging orthodoxy of the first millennium BCE. If this is the case, then the survival of the King List is nothing short of miraculous. That the Weld-Blundell prism was buried and forgotten, but not destroyed, that it was discovered millennia later and could still be read, that we can hold in our hands a direct physical link to the scribes who created it nearly 4,000 years ago, this is a triumph of human memory over oblivion. And it reminds us that the past is not lost, not really. It is waiting, buried in the earth, encoded in ancient texts, preserved in traditions and myths, and half-remembered stories. All we have to do is dig. All we have to do is listen. All we have to do is be willing to question what we think we know. The Sumerian King List is more than just an ancient document. It is a challenge to our certainty, a crack in the foundation of our understanding of history. It asks us to consider possibilities that seem impossible. It demands that we take seriously the claims of the ancients, that we treat them not as primitive children inventing fairy tales, but as intelligent observers trying to make sense of their world and preserve information for future generations. And it reminds us that the boundary between myth and history is not as clear as we like to pretend. History shades into myth as we go further back in time, and myth often preserves historical truth in symbolic form. The question is not whether the King List is history or myth. The question is, what kind of history is being recorded and what kind of truth is being preserved in the myth? And that question remains open, waiting for new evidence, new discoveries, new ways of reading the old texts. Waiting for someone brave enough to look at those impossible numbers, 200 years, and ask not how can we explain them away, but what if they're trying to tell us something true? The story of the Sumerian King List is ultimately the story of human memory and human ambition. The ambition to preserve the past, to understand our origins, to connect with something larger than our individual lives. The scribes who carved these words into clay 4,000 years ago were doing exactly what we are doing now, trying to make sense of the past, trying to honour those who came before, trying to create a record that will outlast us. They succeeded. Their words survived the fall of empires, the death of languages, the burial of cities. They survived because they were carved in clay, baked hard and buried deep. They survived because they mattered enough that someone made sure they would survive. And now they are here, in a museum in Oxford, and we can read them, we can study them, we can argue about what they mean, but we cannot ignore them, we cannot pretend they do not exist. We cannot simply dismiss them as primitive myth when they claim, with such specificity, with such mathematical precision, with such bureaucratic sobriety, that 8 kings ruled for 200 years before the flood swept over the earth. That is the challenge of the Sumerian King List. That is the mystery that will not go away. That is the secret they don't want you to know, not because anyone is actively hiding it, but because accepting it requires us to fundamentally rethink our assumptions about history, about civilization, about humanity itself. And that is the most difficult thing any culture can do, to question its own origin story, to admit that the past might be stranger and more complex than we ever imagined. If you've come this far in our journey through one of history's most enigmatic texts, perhaps a gentle like and subscribe would be a wonderful way to show your support. Let us know in the comments what you think. Are the antediluvian kings mythological exaggeration, encoded astronomical data, or something more? Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Thank you for having our back. For more deep dives into the mysteries of the ancient world, check out our latest videos. Until then, keep questioning, keep seeking, and remember, the past is never as settled as we think it is.